Hello? So that was half of my speech there, so I'm going to just go to the second half. The way I got here was I started out writing Mac software. I got a Mac back when it was 128K and it had floppy drives, and you programmed it using Elisa, and it was great fun. And just went from there. And I have been doing almost nothing but Mac software development since '84 till about 2008. My last project as a contractor in 2002 was for a company called Prismo Graphics, which was acquired by Apple and turned into an app they called LiveType, part of the Final Cut Pro suite. And when that got acquired, I went along and managed the team to turn that into LiveType, and had a fantastic time working for Apple. You know, the people there are really brilliant. This was before the App Store, so they weren't evil yet, and it was great to be able to think of some framework that you'd been using all along but had questions about, and instead of just asking tech support or emailing your friends, you just go find the person who wrote it, ask directly, look at the source code, and find out the answers. And it was incredible, and it was a great learning experience. But I also knew that I didn't want to stay in a big company because it's insanely frustrating. There's process there, and some of it's good. I came to appreciate things like source code management and bug tracking at a higher level. But some of it just is soul crushing, and some of it is secrecy, where you don't know what the person across the hall is working on. You could be collaborating and making great things that would delight customers, but instead you have no idea what projects the other is working on. So when the iPhone SDK was announced, I jumped ship in 2008, hired a couple of other engineers, and we rushed to make an app. We didn't know what we were going to do at first. We went up to the whiteboard and we started writing ideas for apps, and some of them were ridiculous, some of them were impossible, which we found out after the SDK shipped. And others, we realized there were other companies who were better suited to do a great job of than we were. So the one we chose, we called Air Sharing. When we started, of course, there were no apps in the App Store. By the time we were finished, there were already 2 apps that did exactly what our app was going to do. So we had to get noticed. And the way we did that was to make the app free for 2 weeks, which was fortunate because I was late in signing my developer paid apps contract, and we had to wait anyway, so it's fortuitous. And 1 million people downloaded in the first 2 weeks, because it wasn't just a sale, it was actually free, and it was going to be a $10 app, and did very well. At the time, there were 1,200 apps, but by the time we finished, and it wasn't yet as hard as it is now to get noticed, but it was still somewhat hard. You had to be somewhere near the front page or something to get seen. Other apps we've done since then are print sharing. Started out as a feature in Air Sharing, but the way we like to work is not just to develop apps and sell them to people, but to develop frameworks, which then we can reuse and turn into new apps, or as some new opportunity arises because we think of a new app idea, or some partner comes along and says, why don't we do this thing together? We can take some of those frameworks and glom them together and make an app out of that. So print sharing was the print feature from Air Sharing, extracted and turned into a separable app. And it was probably the prettiest app that we did. It had the most attention to detail because it had the smallest amount of functionality. And that's when I realized that we could do better if we stopped making big Swiss Army knife style apps and focused on a task, making a task really pleasant and painless. So our strategy on app design has evolved over time. That's one of those cases. Air Display is our current most successful app. It is the app that lets you take your iPad and use it as a second monitor for your computer. So we have Mac and Windows virtual video drivers that send pixels or entire screens as fast as we can over to the iPad and display them on the screen. And that's evolved into not just an iPad app with accompanying software on the Mac and Windows machine, but now also an Android version. We've got a Windows version coming. We have a Mac client. So one Mac can be the second screen for another computer. And we've done ports of these things to other platforms as well. And so if anybody's interested in relative sales, since there were some great graphs earlier, we sell Air Display for the iPad and iPhone fairly successfully. In the Mac store, we do about a fifth of the sales that we do in the iPhone store. We've also ported to Android, and we're in Google Play. About 2% of our sales are Android, partly because our app excels on a tablet form factor, and there just aren't any compelling tablets for Android besides Kindle Fire, and the screen's a little small to use as a second monitor. So, yeah, about 2%. I'd say it's 1/10 of the size of our Mac sales is Android and Google Play. About 1/5 of that goes through the Amazon store. And the smallest amount, or the second smallest amount, is Samsung Bada, which is about 1/10 of the amount we sell in Android, in Amazon. And the very worst is Intel AppUp, where we sold 4 copies, and I bought one of those. It's kind of sad. But they're trying hard, and they're spending a lot of money, so you got to give them that. So we've done those apps. We did one called Air Dictate, and I'll tell you more about that because it's a sad story, and it no longer exists. And we've done probably 50 different partner apps for people. Some of that was shovelware, and we rewrote an engine, and we had grand ideas that we would become a publishing platform. And if you had a CD-ROM or a DVD with video clips, we could turn that into an app and let users easily navigate and watch your video clips. Not a very compelling app, not a very compelling strategy. We're not doing that anymore. The apps are still out there, so if anybody wants to learn how to do Filipino stick fighting or play better basketball, we have apps. But that was part of our evolving strategy. You're engineers and designers, you can make up all kinds of apps, but there has to be a reason why you take on a project. And if we're not master Filipino stick fighters, we shouldn't be doing an app on that. If we have no passion for it, we're not going to do a better job than somebody else would for that. Becoming a publishing platform, that's not an engineering or design problem or project. That's a financial and investment project, and it's just not our passion. So instead, what we're doing is starting up a new consulting group, which is next door. We rented another 3,000 square feet, and we're going to hire people double the size of our team. We're at 12 employees right now. We'll probably be up to 20-some in a few months. And that group is going to concentrate on contract and custom app development. And it actually be pretty fun at that point. We'll be able to use that as a talent pool, sort of a breeding pool for potential hires for Avatron, while providing services to all of the many startups and small businesses that wish they had an app. How many times a day does somebody come to you with an app idea? Everybody wants an app. So we're going to transition to the part where I rant on Apple for a little bit. So if there are any Apple employees in the room, sorry. They've done an amazing thing. Apple made a platform where one person, 3 people, can create something from nothing, and not just build it, but then sell it without creating a store or negotiating with distributors or doing packaging or shrink wrap or printing DVDs or anything. You just hit a submit button, wait 3 days to 6 months, cry a lot, and then you've got an app. But they grew this way faster than we expected to. I think way faster than they expected to. Several months into the process, the rumor was that there was one guy who reviewed every app, the senior VP who was also in charge of the Apple stores. That doesn't scale to 600,000 apps. It may have worked with 800, but others were adamant that was not a winning strategy for making a great retail experience. So, how have we been hurt by the frustrations at Apple? The very first thing that happened was we finally got air sharing into the store. It didn't take too long. It shot up to the chart. It was #1 top selling by units. They didn't have a grossing list yet, but it was right at the top. And then the next day it disappeared from the charts entirely, and you couldn't see it. And it was that way for about 3 weeks. So I don't know how many sales we lost at that point, but I emailed everybody I knew. I had great contacts from back at Apple. I have about 4,000 people still in my address book. I emailed everybody that was at like a director level and above and sent out this mass, and then everybody ignored me. So finally, just in sheer frustration, I CC'd Phil Schiller and Steve Jobs, because they had their email addresses around, and said, I'm just CCing these guys because I think they ought to know what's going on. Kind of ranting and not expecting to hear back. So Steve Jobs sends back the next morning from his iPhone. He says, that's just the way it works. When you go from free to paid, we reset your sales numbers down to 0, so you're not in the store yet. So I said, well, that may be, but I think there's a bug in the reset, because I think it's being reset continuously instead of just once. And he never responded, but within an hour and a half it was fixed and we were back in the store. And so they didn't just have one guy reviewing the apps, they had one guy responding to the developer concerns, as far as I can tell. We were also rejected. Our apps have been rejected for so many reasons at this point. Just air sharing alone, we've probably submitted 60 versions to the store. So we have an edition just for iPhone and iPod Touch, one for iPad and one universal. If I could start over, we wouldn't have that, but for historical reasons, that's what we're stuck with. So yeah, 60 submissions. Sometimes one of the three, which are identical except for compatibility flags, would get rejected for some reason. Sometimes we would get rejected for something that we've been doing all along, or that 200 or 300 other apps are doing as well. Sometimes we would have a method that happened to coincidentally be named the same thing as a private method somewhere, or more like a class in that case, and we'd be rejected for that. So we just have to rename it and resubmit. Sometimes, as you've heard from others, is a keyword that offended, or it was something in the app description, and we learn case by case, how to get around some of those things. The app description can be changed dynamically, so it's really easy to make a really simple app description while you're in the submission process, and then once it goes live, to put in your full description. If your what's new says bug fixes, your approval will probably be faster, or especially if you say critical bug fixes, than if you say added support for browsing web content or something like that. You can always change that part later. Not that I'm advocating that, don't do that. We had fun with Apple Legal. We've gotten to know them pretty well. Let's see, our original icon for Air Display had a vertical rectangle on it, representing a tablet to be used as a second screen. It's kind of an ugly icon anyway, because my Illustrator skills aren't that great. So we got a message from Apple Legal, not because we submitted the app, but because we submitted a trademark application on that icon. And they said, I'm sorry, you can't trademark that because it has an iPad in it, and iPad is, here's the trademark number for the iPad. And I said, well, it's not an iPad because we have an Android version as well. It's a generic tablet. And they said, no, it's not. I said, yes, it is. They win. And I said, well, it's just a rectangle. It doesn't have the button. Yours has a button. That's the distinctive feature. And I said, well, whatever. And so I said, well, what if I took the rectangle and I rotated it sideways? And she said, fine. So we resubmitted our trademark application, and they had no problem with that, and that's where it stands. The final thing, which is the saddest to me, because I think this was actually our prettiest app. The print sharing was when we put it out. It hasn't been terribly successful, but I really like the interface on it. It does one thing, there's one screen. This one also has one screen, and the original version had a button. So you would press the button. First you'd select your computer up at the top from a list of, these things are detected by Bonjour. And you'd press the talk button, you'd say something, and whatever you said would be converted into text and sent over to your Mac. And it would turn into text, just as if you typed it at your Mac keyboard. So if you didn't have any fingers due to a tragic accident, or if you just didn't like to type, or your hands were busy with something else, you could use this. Or more likely, like most of our users, you just wanted to geek out by doing something new with Siri. That was kind of fun. So this was live for a while. It was pretty popular for a couple of weeks. It wasn't never going to be a great seller or enable us to hire extra engineers. But it was fun to work on, and it had good aesthetics, I thought. They're probably the designers here who shoot me down on that one, because it's a little too skeuomorphic. But we got back rejection for one of our updates saying that we were depending on private APIs. So we did another one of the no, we're not, yes, you are things, where we said that we're not using any private APIs. I'll describe how we did it now, because it doesn't need to be secret at this point. There's already an interface for using Siri text recognition, or voice recognition on the iPhone. You just put up any text field, and it brings up a keyboard, and one of the buttons is a tiny little microphone button. So if you touch the tiny microphone button, you talk, it turns into text. As long as you don't speak with a non-American accent, it gets converted into pretty accurate text and shows up in your text field. So we exactly did that, except for two things. We found the keyboard and the text field and made them invisible in one version. Another version, we actually moved our big graphic plane up in front of those. But then when you tapped on the button, because that's not exactly where the little microphone button is, this is the magic. We took the keyboard and we moved it so that before we passed that tap through our plane into the keyboard behind it, we moved the keyboard so that your tap would actually be on top of the microphone button. And then when you let up, we'd move it back. But you never saw that because it was all invisible and obscured. So we said, we're not doing, we told them exactly how we're doing it, and they said, yeah, but we could change the keyboard in the future, and then you'd be tapping on a Q button or something. So we changed the interface, and we got rid of the button entirely. All that magic is gone. Now you just press the button, and when you have a text field up, if you hold it up to your ear and you start talking, it will beep a couple of times, and Siri will convert that dutifully into text for you. So we changed it to that, and they then not only didn't take our update, they removed the whole app from the store with the excuse that it violated their Siri trademark. Now, we never mentioned Siri. You'll see there's you probably can't see it, but underneath the little microphone grill, it says Portland, Oregon, USA. It used to say powered by Siri, but before we actually submitted it to Apple, we realized that would be a bad idea because that is a trademark. We said raise to speak. Anyway, you can't fight them because it's not a legal issue. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But what we learned is you can't focus on these roadblocks. You can't get stuck behind something a barrier that Apple puts up and just stop. You can't fight them on it because you're going to lose. The best thing is to concentrate on all the things you can do. The App Store and iPhone, the iOS platform are incredibly powerful. There's a lot of potential in there for you. There's so much open source stuff you can put in that to get caught up on one thing and fight that battle, it's not the road to success. It's just a way to compound frustration. And as I was saying, it's not a legal issue about things like trademarks with Apple because even if you did have the resources to go to court with them and you win because they had a ridiculous argument to begin with and didn't understand what trademarks were, they could kill your business model by rejecting all of your other apps or revoking your developer ID. It's not a legal issue. I do, however, recommend trademarking your name and icon just so that if you have the Flipboard app and somebody else uses the Flipboard name in your keywords, you can complain to Apple and say, because now that you have great contacts at Apple Legal, you can say, hey, I just thought I'd say hi, and also could you tell that guy to change that keyword for And of course, one of the things we learned was a lot of different ways to navigate the app review process. So app review can take 18 hours, that's been our shortest one. It can take a month and a half, it's been our worst. And I know others have much worse stories about getting accepted into the store, especially early on. But during the process where they're reviewing or waiting for something to go through a queue or sending it to the app review board or whatever mysterious incantations they wave over your app, there are some things you can still be doing. You can submit your app and check the hold for developer review button so that when it gets approved, it won't immediately go live. So while it's being reviewed, you can finish your, localizing the what's new text or anything you're changing in your app description. You can change stuff on your website that you need to do, and you can complete the testing. If you think it's done, but you still want to let it bake for a few days and let your beta testers bang on it for a while to see if they can find problems, do that while they're reviewing. And if you find out that there were showstopper bugs and you don't want it to go live, just revoke your submission, whether it's been approved or not, and resubmit. So you can do a little bit of concurrency there. And I'm going to say some things that we decided not to do, but there are things that we thought about doing. I wouldn't recommend it. I said don't chat to use private methods in classes, and what I meant by that was not chat. That's a typo. What I meant was I have no idea how that happened. Maybe I used Siri. But what I meant to say was don't construct a string and then use things like class from string and then get private classes and private methods nefariously. It works, but if you get caught doing that because Apple changes the way that they search for this, suppose they start checking for private classes, private methods at runtime instead of just scanning your app for strings, I really suspect that they would revoke your developer license and not just not just reject your app. I'd be really worried about, because you're jeopardizing your whole company, assuming that you're just doing iPhone apps, just for some particular feature or some clever way of solving a problem. Don't change the behavior during the review where you set a flag on your website and then your app checks this hidden file, and once the review process is over, you enable your illegal functionality. Because really, you're trying to make a partnership with your partnership manager at Apple, and even with the anonymous reviewers. And another thing not to do, don't check to see if the device is running on Apple's reserved IP range from 17 on, which can work, but remember that they check apps online and offline, because so many apps that do online functionality will crash when they're offline, that one of the first things they do is they try to launch your app offline and make sure it behaves correctly and either informs you why it's not working or does something else. So if you're checking to make sure that they're on the Apple range and then turning off your illegal functionality while you're on Apple, they will probably catch you, and you'll have a bad time of it. I don't know that from personal experience. Now, for marketing your app, there are a lot of different things you can do. I'm going to kind of run through this stuff because people have talked about it before. Your main visibility to people starts out with just a name and an icon and a price. Then it goes into the top couple of lines of your description, and then it expands into the rest of the description. In that order, you kind of need to make sure you catch people's attention and convey the message you want about the quality of your workmanship and how much attention you pay to details. Talk to people who influence other people. Don't try to talk to everybody. That's buying an ad. It's very expensive. If you talk to a blogger, if you talk to a journalist at the New York Times, it's much more effective than trying to talk directly to people about your app. Use PR if you have a budget for it. If not, you can do your own press releases and pitch them to social media. Find an MBA intern who wants to do marketing communications. They'd love to pitch your press release, even write your press releases and pitch them. And finally, get featured. People have talked about how to do this, but study the design of Apple's already featured apps and do whatever they're doing. Try to discover the philosophy. Do a survey of all the apps that have gotten the large image up there on the screen, and look at those apps and study them. And write down what you like and don't like, and glean things. When Apple introduces new features into iOS or into their devices, just adopt it, whether it makes sense or not. Not if it's completely ridiculous, but if they're pushing a new feature, if you adopt it, you're much more likely to be featured. Part of sort of the first thing about what Apple likes to feature, always get the smallest number of features that fully solves a problem and complete it 100%. Don't take as many features as you want and do them 80%. That's not what's going to get you noticed there. And finally, design for particular markets. So if you've got one app that could be used by education, it could also be used by business, think about making two apps and marketing them differently. There are ways to market to the people who decide to feature apps. What we did at one time, very quickly, is that we made a Facebook ad and made it target just to Apple employees. And we made it very clear that you're going to be charged $10 if you bought our app. So you don't really want to click here. And then we got a pay per click ad rate. So we ended up paying, I think, $350 for an ad that was viewed 1.8 million times by Apple employees or people who claimed to be Apple employees. And it didn't work. We didn't get featured, but I thought it was a clever idea. Anyway, thank you very much. Contact me if you have any questions or just want to talk. That's me, and that's my company on Twitter. Thanks. Cheers, man.